My name is Otto Wood, and I was born in 1893, deep in the remote mountains of North Carolina. Judging by the folks who lived in our small community, me and my 3 siblings were living a pretty decent life. After all, my pa was a modest farmer, and ma was a dressmaker. But back then, if the man of the house passed away, a family was left scrambling for survival, while the young children who were left behind assumed responsibility for bringing money in the house. So it was for my family. You see, my pa passed away from typhoid fever when I was just about 4 years old. Heck, I barely remember him, but his death set me on a path that I would follow for the rest of my life. I realized early on that I was different from other kids. I was born with one leg shorter than the other and a club foot, and this gave me a distinctive walk. Now this caused many folks to feel sorry for me. No, but you shouldn't, because I quickly learned that I could use this to my advantage with getting away with just about anything. After Pa passed away, Ma took up a relationship with a married man, and she had 2 illegitimate children. Her hands were full, and that left me and my brothers pretty much raising ourselves. While my brothers worked on the farm, I spent most every day exploring in the woods, catching snakes, and walking the railroad that passed our farm. I was always rambling and getting into stuff. I'd put my ear on those tracks and listen for the train coming, and then I'd climb into a tree and watch with excitement as the locomotive would come roaring through like thunder. Sometimes the conductor would even blow the whistle for me as he passed. I dreamed about the outside world that those tracks surely led to, and one day I swore that I'd catch one of those trains and find out for myself. Finally, when I was about 7, Ma decided she'd put me in school, but from the first day, that teacher didn't like me, and I didn't like being confined and held like a hostage in that room. I couldn't sit still, and I didn't care for nothing he was teaching. The other kids gave me a hard time because of my limp, but mostly because of my raggedy clothes. Once the teacher spanked my brother, and I picked up a rock and I almost knocked that fella out. He chased me for nearly a mile, but even with my limp, I could run fast as anyone, and there was no way he could ever catch me. The next day, Ma told me to go to school and apologize to the teacher, but once I turned the bend on that dirt path, just out of sight, I quickly darted into the woods, towards the train tracks. After a few hours of walking them, I came to a depot. Foreigners were busy getting on and off trains. There was a buzz of excitement in the air. The conductor would check each ticket as the passengers loaded, and I saw a lady with several children and many luggages getting her tickets checked. So I jumped in with all her kids, and I snuck right past the conductor. Just like that, I was on a train bound for Winston-Salem, and when I stepped off that train onto a city street, it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. I spent the whole day looking through glass windows into the shops, the hustle and the bustle of men in suits up and down the sidewalk, and the constant sound of wagons and horse hooves up and down the street excited my imagination. Around 10 o'clock that night, I flagged a wagon down, and I asked him for something to eat. The man was a tobacco farmer who had brought his crop to the market. He fed me and he let me sleep in his wagon that night. The next day, I rode with him to Madison, North Carolina, where I spent a few days with him before hopping another train to Roanoke, Virginia, and then another bound for Maryland. As we were traveling, the conductor found me and discovered that I didn't have a ticket or parents on the train, and he turned me in to police as soon as we stopped in Hagerstown, Maryland. As soon as the lawman saw my pathetic limp and raggedy clothing, he immediately took pity in his heart, and he purchased me a new suit and a ticket back home. As soon as I got home, Ma tore me up something good with a leather strap as soon as I took one step off of that train, and she told the workers at the train station to run me off if I ever showed my face there again. A few days later, after the soreness of that whooping wore off, I managed to slip into a large wooden box that was being loaded onto a freight car bound for West Virginia. And once that train was underway, I was discovered again and turned into the police in Bluefield, West Virginia. It turns out the police chief knew an uncle of mine who lived in a place near the Tug River, and so he sent me there. Now, my uncle was in the blockade liquor manufacturing business, or as most folks called it, running moonshine up the Tug River. He took me in, and I became his assistant, where I quickly learned the entire process. But the most exciting part is when he would take me to the saloons to deliver his goods. You have to keep in mind that West Virginia was basically the Wild West back in those days, especially in this section that was run by a clan called the Hatfields. Time and time again, I witnessed the Hatfields having gun battles with men in the saloons that would spill out into the streets. Most of the boys my age would run and hide when the violence broke out. Not me, though. My eyes got wide, and I followed the battles from start to finish. The Hatfields noticed that I wasn't scared, and they began to take a liking to me, and they would let me sit at the poker table with them. They said I was good luck. I would watch those cards intently and study the men's eyes as the gambling took place. One day, one of the Hatfields gave me a shiny quarter, and he dealt me a hand of cards, and he set a shot glass of whiskey next to me. "All right, young Otto, you've sat and watched long enough. Let's see if you can actually gamble," the Hatfield said. I picked up that shot glass and poured the whole thing down my throat, wiped my mouth, and said, "All right, now we're talking." They started out by letting me win a few hands on purpose, but I was a fast learner, and before long, I could gamble just as well as any man. By the time I was 10 years old, I spent most days in the saloons, but occasionally my uncle would send me back to visit my ma in North Carolina. During these visits, it was clear that I wasn't anything like the other kids. I was street smart and street wise. I could con the other kids out of nearly anything, and if I couldn't con them, I would just outright steal it. On one of these visits, I had my first trouble with the law. You see, there was a boy who lived next to my ma's house who had the fanciest, shiniest bike I'd ever laid my eyes on, and I wanted it something terrible. So that night, I snuck over there and quietly pushed the bike back to our house, and the next morning, I set out on it. I had my mind made up that I'd ride it back to West Virginia. The only problem was, I soon discovered that I couldn't ride a bike. I kept on wrecking, and I spent more time pushing that thing than I did riding it. Before long, a policeman stopped me, and after questioning me, he threw me in jail in Wilkesboro, where I stayed for nearly 5 months waiting on my court date. While I was there, I made friends with another boy who was a lot like me, and he had a plan on stealing some guns from a hardware store once we got out. As much as I love guns, oh heck, you could count me in, I said enthusiastically. The only problem was, when my court date finally came, the judge sentenced me to 6 months on the chain gang for stealing that bike. However, once the chain gang foreman took a look at me, at how small and disabled I was, he refused to put me to work. Instead, he put me on carrying the water bucket to the other prisoners, before finally just sending me back home. On my way home, I got to thinking about that hardware store and those guns that my cellmate had told me about. So I broke into that store that night and carried out as many guns as I could tote out of there. The next day, I flagged a wagoneer down, and I asked him if he was interested in the guns, and he bought them from me. But as soon as he turned his back to water his horses, I stole the guns back, and I ended up selling them that afternoon to an elderly woman. And that night as she slept, I snuck back inside her house and stole the guns back. I was going to sell them again, but a policeman saw me with the guns, and back to jail I went. A few months later, I arrived in court, a small boy, with my ankles chained together. The judge instantly took pity on me. "Is there anyone in this courtroom that can speak on behalf of this boy?" the judge asked. The request was met with silence, and I stood there and I mustered up the most sorrowful expression I could put on my face, with tears welling up in my eyes. The judge was a Christian man, and he asked me, "Son, tell me what you know about Sunday school and God." "Well, Your Honor, to be perfectly honest with you, the Lord and me, we're strangers, and that's why I took those guns. I'm powerful sorry for it, and I see now that I was wrong." I took a small couple steps, emphasizing my limp as the chains rattled on my ankles. "You have my word, sir. I'll never get into trouble again, so help me God." And with that, the judge released me and told me to go back home to my ma. For the next 3 years, I hopped trains from state to state and spending months at a time living with the Hatfields in West Virginia. By the time I was 13, I thought I would try my hand at making an honest living. So I took a job as a trapper in the coal mines. I was doing okay, but I would occasionally feel the need to supplement my income. I once stole a boat and floated it down the Tug River and sold it to another fella. The cops chased me down a few days later and found a concealed weapon on me, and that earned me another 4 months on the chain gang. Once again, the foreman saw how pitiful I was, and he refused to put me to work. Instead, he gave me light jobs, and within a few days I made my break, and none of those fellas could catch me. I'll never forget the looks on their faces as I sprinted away like a world-class athlete, never to be seen again. And by the time I was 15, I had committed a string of petty crimes. I stole another bicycle and then 6 pearl-handled pistols and several knives from a hardware store. I had robbed a few slot machines, but in a twist of irony, the one that got me arrested was when I stole a pack of chewing gum from a store. The judge had had enough of me, and he sent me to Stonewall Jackson's training school. After a few weeks, I managed to escape, and I was on the run again. Soon, I got a job working as a firefighter for the Norfolk and Western Railway running between Virginia and West Virginia. I had turned into a bit of a ladies' man, and I had a girlfriend in both states. Just when things were looking up for me, I lost my hand in a railroad accident, and both women ended up pregnant. I tried to do right by marrying the one in West Virginia, but because I couldn't legally marry the other one in Virginia, I was sentenced to 2 years in Virginia State Penitentiary at the tender age of 17 years old. After only being locked up for 5 days, I made a break for the fence, where I quickly climbed over it and headed for the mountains. The guards had a pack of bloodhounds on me for 3 days, as I led them on a wild goose chase. They came close to catching me a few times, but they never did, and they finally gave up. Now, I was officially a fugitive on the run, so I couldn't get a legal job. I took up gambling and moonshining, and I headed west through Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. I never stayed in a town for more than a couple days, just long enough to win enough money or to steal enough loot to move on. Out west, I got a reputation as a tough guy from the east. I carried 2 big Colt pistols on my side, and I even had a few shootouts as I would try to escape a town. As I made my way back east through Missouri and Ohio, I robbed a train and I stole a couple automobiles when I was arrested in Ohio and returned to Virginia State Prison, where they promptly added another year to my sentence for escaping. I was only there for about 3 months when I used a couple of bars of soap to make a gun, which I held on a guard, and he walked me right out of that prison and handed me the keys to his car. By now, I was 23 years old and had been divorced twice. I just couldn't catch a break, and again I stole a car and was sentenced to a chain gang because the judge didn't know I was wanted in Virginia. Again, the foreman of the chain gang took pity on me and put me on water detail. And well, you should already know how that turned out. I decided to try my luck in Tennessee, and one night I found myself in a colored pool hall in Chattanooga. I was the only white man in the building. Within a few hours, I had won every dollar that was in the room, and as I tried to leave, they blocked the door. Every man either had a pull stick in their hand or a pistol. All hell broke loose. And after the bullets stopped flying, 3 of them were lying on the floor, and I escaped. I realized I'd been hit twice in the stomach, and as soon as I got out of the hospital, I was sent to Tennessee Penitentiary. By now, I was getting quite a reputation for breaking out of prisons, and I lived up to it again and escaped within 6 months of my arrival. I quickly stole a Ford car, which unbelievably had the keys in the ignition. This had to be a sign from God, I thought. But a few miles down the road, I realized that all the tires were shot and 2 of them were flat. But wouldn't you know it, as soon as I broke down, I spotted another Ford parked at a fella's house in the distance. And within a few minutes, I had worked out a deal where I got all 4 of those tires for free, since he was sound asleep in his bed at the time. I remained on the run through Georgia and Florida when I decided to try to visit my mom again in North Carolina, but I was spotted by the law and sent back to Tennessee Penitentiary. The warden was steaming mad when they brought me back. "Son, this is the great state of Tennessee, and folks don't escape our jails and just get away with it. Your running days are over, and I promise you, it'll never happen again." And it turns out he was right, for 10 months at least, and I escaped again. Now, I don't want y'all to get the idea that breaking out of prison is easy. I always had to come up with ingenious ways. You see, they had me working in a cafeteria, and we had a big box of canned goods come in one day. So a couple buddies of mine packed me up in that box, and they set me in the trash dumpster. Once darkness fell that night, I emerged from the box and headed for the fence. But the guards, they spotted me right away. Soon the bloodhounds were on me again. I managed to stay ahead of them for 3 hours, but I was getting tired, and the sounds of the dogs were getting very close. I could even see the lights of the lanterns closing in. Most folks would have given up in that moment, but me, I ain't never been a quitter. I saw a barn in the distance, so I made a break for it, where I found a horse. And he didn't have a bridle on, so I wrapped a piece of wire around his neck, and off I went. By lunch the next day, I had traveled nearly 40 miles away from that prison when I ran upon a small town. But word of my escape had reached there before I did, and I was immediately recognized and surrounded by several men. I refused to give up, but I didn't have a firearm, and trying to fight several men with one fist is always a losing proposition. I took a brutal beating and was taken to the doctor. My head was bleeding pretty bad, and while the doctor bandaged me up, I pretended to be hurt much worse than I really was. I just laid there moaning in pain. It would be nearly 4 hours before the next train could come through and take me back to prison. So they picked the biggest, baddest man in the group to take me back by wagon to Nashville. He was 6'5" and over 250 pounds of muscle. "Big John, you better tie that fella up before you and set out," one man said. The big man took one look at me, all crippled and beaten to a pulp, and he burst into laughter. "No, I don't think that'll be necessary." And that, my friend, was music to my ears. Halfway through the journey, when he least expected it, I jumped up and rabbit punched him in the throat, and off and running through the woods I went, a free man again. All told, Otto Wood broke out of prison 11 times during his life of crime, and that's in addition to the dozens of times that he broke out of jails and chain gangs. He had become a celebrity. Folks called him the Houdini of Cell Block A. There wasn't a jail that could hold him, and his face was plastered on the front page of nearly every newspaper in America on a monthly basis for years. Now, the vast majority of his crimes weren't violent, but that all changed in 1923. Otto was down on his luck, and he needed money pretty bad, so he pawned his grandfather's watch at a pawn shop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, according to the agreement, he had 30 days to return and get his watch back. Yet, when he returned only 10 days later, the pawn shop owner had already sold his grandfather's watch. Otto was fit to be tied, and he flew into a rage. He looked down on the counter and saw an antique pistol, and he picked it up and hit the pawn shop owner over the head, killing him dead. Otto always claimed that he never meant to kill the man, just teach him a lesson. However, he was convicted and sent back to prison, this time on death row. But of course, he escaped again. Accident or not, Otto Wood was now a fugitive killer on the run, and he was wanted dead or alive all across America. Otto's final showdown with the law happened in 1930 in Salisbury, North Carolina. Otto had rolled into town with a buddy, and together they were planning on robbing the license plate office in town, since they were known to keep a lot of cash on hand. The duo first had lunch, where a customer recognized Otto and alerted the cops. Within minutes, the law was waiting on the outlaw to exit the cafe, which he did with his hands in his coat pocket. "You there! Let me see your left hand. Pull it out of your pocket," the lawman demanded, knowing that Otto was missing that hand. Instead, Otto pulled out his right hand, which held a Colt pistol, and he pointed it right at the cop as he climbed in the back of the police car. "Yeah, I'm Otto Wood, and what you gonna do about it? Nothing. You ain't gonna do nothing except drive me to the train station right now." The sheriff quickly pretended to obey the command. He put the car in gear, but in a flash, he opened the door and he rolled to the ground. Otto jumped out of the back of the car at the same time. Otto fired several shots at the sheriff, but he was protected by the engine in the radiator. Suddenly, the lawman popped up, and both men's eyes met. They both fired at the same time. Otto's bullet went through the sheriff's ear, but the sheriff's bullet went right through Otto's cheek. Just like that, Otto Wood's days of outrunning the law came to a crashing end as he fell dead in the street. A few days later, over 20,000 people came to see Appalachia's most famous outlaw laid to rest.